turned on? Like the other one. No, no. All we gotta do. That many people in the waiting room? Why don't we've got a bunch of people on Zoom now, so why don't we go ahead and get started. Welcome. I'm Steve Pinkerton. I'm the general manager for the district. Thank you for everybody who came out in the cold and wet and came in on Zoom as well. Before we get started on incorporation this evening, we haven't done a non-incorporation community meeting in a while, so we try to once a quarter give an update on other issues of interest to the district. So before we get started on incorporation tonight, we thought we'd give you a little information on what is probably long-term one of the most critical issues here in the community, and not just in this community, but in the state, but particularly in this community, and that's on water supply. So Karen Morgan, our utility manager, is here to give a more, not quite brief, very informative discussion on water supply. And if you have any questions for the end of her presentation, go ahead, and we've got sheets of paper. Do we have them over in the back as well? Yes. So, and then just hand over to Jody your questions, and we'll answer those at the end of her presentation. And if you're on Zoom, just write them in the chat, and we will transcribe them from the chat and answer the questions after her presentation. So I'm gonna go ahead and let's do introductions once we know everybody's here, but let's get ahead and start with the water supply, and then we'll do some introductions. So I'll introduce Karen, and then we'll introduce everybody else once we get started. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, everybody. I'm going to do a quick presentation on our water supply here at Mountain House Community Service District. So I'll talk tonight about our world's water, California's water, the district's water supply, our changing climate, adapting to our changing climate, and improving the district's water supply reliability. Next slide. The world's water. The Earth is about 71% water, totaling 332.5 million cubic miles of water, but only 97% of this water is saline, so it's unavailable. Only about 2.5% of all water is fresh water, and most of this is locked up in ice caps and glaciers and groundwater. This leaves a very small fraction of water available, and this is found in our surface water as lakes, rivers, and streams for all of us to use, including the district's water supply. America's water. America has a significant storage capacity of groundwater, and this makes up a large portion of the water supply, especially on the West Coast. In California, the aquifer under our feet is the Central Valley Aquifer. The Central Valley is 20,000 square miles. It's 400 miles long and about 50 miles wide. In some areas, the aquifer is 3 to 6 miles deep. The aquifer is subdivided into basins for management purposes. The district resides in the San Joaquin Basin, specifically the Tracy Subbasin. The Tracy Subbasin is 238,429 acres, 370 square miles. in the San Joaquin and Alameda counties. The San Joaquin groundwater basin is a vital resource. It's a massive reservoir free for our water storage and recovery needs, and it has significant storage flexibility. Next slide. Surface water is the most available source of fresh water. On the left, you can see in the United States which state uses the most surface water based on how dark the state is blue. The eastern US exercises riparian water rights, while the West exercises prior appropriation, which is first in time, first in right, as well as riparian water rights. California uses a very complex and complicated blend of these rights. Groundwater has been managed by laws similar to mining laws, where the resource under your land belongs to you and it's free to use, regardless of the impact to your neighbors. This is changing as the sustainable groundwater management plans take hold in the region and are implemented. On the right, you can see a great chart of how all of the available water in comparison to population growth. All of the water looks like it's used a little bit more wisely in recent years, with consumption dropping, even though the population is rising. And these are a little bit dated, but it's still a good illustration. Next slide. The image on the left is the route of our surface water system in California, with all of the major headwaters in the high Sierras. This flows down to the mouth of the Delta. Snowpack and snowmelt feeds the system through hot and dry summers. In the middle image, we have Old River, and this passes by Mountain House. It's a tributary of the San Joaquin River. We hope to tap into this surface water resource with the Wickland Cut project that I'll talk about later. On the right, our sole water supply is from an intake pump station located off the Clifton Court forebay, essentially pulling water from the Delta. Next slide. So for Mountain House, our water supply is provided to the district by a surface water agreement and an allocation of BVID's pre-1914 water rights. This allocation is 9,813 cubic feet annually. To deliver this water to our customers, we have to meet very strict EPA regulations, which are enforced and often made more stringent by the California State Water Resources Control Board. The district has a 30 million gallon a day water treatment plant. It's a T4 facility and a contract operations through Infomark, and it's capable of treating 15 million gallons a day, but it's only permitted for 12.5. Next slide. Our water system has some very complicated infrastructure. We have 4 surface water tanks. There's 2 at the water treatment plant and 2 at College Park for a total storage of 16.4 million. And with this water system, there's also several miles of water mains, thousands of valves, and 2 different pressure zones, making it pretty complicated. Next. Mountain House has been carefully tracking water production and population growth for years. You can see the population growth as the red line. The blue bar is water production in acre feet. In our highest year in 2021, Mountain House used 4,877 acre feet of water, and the population was 26,957. You can see this gap growing between the red line and the blue bar, and this is evidence of water conservation practices that have been successful. In California, 60 to 90 million acre feet of year of water is used across the board. This is expected to be reduced by 10% by 2040 due to a changing climate. This is roughly 6 million acre feet. For comparison, California's largest reservoir, Shasta, holds 4.5 million acre feet. As the climate changes in California, it's anticipated there will be longer growing seasons, placing more demand on water supplies. More water will remain evaporated in the atmosphere, less precipitation falling as snow due to increased temperature, which reduces our snowpack. More precipitation will be falling as rain. This means a lot less storage and reduced late summer flows. The U.S. Drought Monitor tracks droughts across the United States. On the left, you can see the U.S. was in its worst drought. This was in 2022. And on the right, you can see the same map in the next fall, and it's significantly different. So the West looks like it's in great shape, but our next drought's coming, and so is the very next wet season to follow. These are drastic changes from one year to the next in California. The entire state was in a drought with 40 million people affected in 2022, and this year there's only 2,961 people affected by the drought in 2023. The district supply has been threatened due to extreme drought. Historically, BBID's pre-1914 water rights have never been curtailed. However, in the last two recent droughts, this has been proven different with 2 threats of curtailment. Next slide. June 2015 was the first curtailment on record, and the first purchase of SSJID water was approved. BBID sued the State Water Resources Control Board to demonstrate that they should have never received a cease and desist order, and they won. In 2022, there was another threat of curtailment. So the changing climate in California, there are ways to buffer from the droughts. Water conservation is a way of life in California. Regulations are underway to reduce urban water use further. This has been ongoing, starting with requiring agencies to install meters on all service connections. Then there was the 20% by 2020 campaign of water conservation regulations. Now SB 606, AB 1668 of 2018, which requires urban water retail suppliers, not individual households or businesses, to be held accountable and to meet their urban water use objectives. Today, the district is required to submit monthly reports on water production, consumption, and water loss, as well as detailed annual reports. Next slide. California has a strategic plan in place which defines how funding projects should be prioritized. This includes new water sources via recycling, such as cleaning wastewater and stormwater to drinking water standards, installing desalination plants, increasing water storage above ground and below ground, reduce demand through conservation on altering farming practices, improve data collection for monitoring and modernizing water rights. Next slide. So we have several options to improve our water supply and reliability. The district plans to diversify and obtain more sources of water, which aligns the state's strategic plan. We are looking at multiple ways to obtain other secure and reliable sources of water with regional benefits in an effort to have redundancy. It's all about diversity of supply, facilities, and diversion points, and different places of storage. The district is considering groundwater wells and aquifer storage and recovery, called ASR, especially since the aquifer is the most accessible and affordable storage solution. Recycled water and obtaining water rights to the wastewater treatment plant effluent that will be nearly drinking water standards after the completion of the MBR facility. Purchasing water is always on the table. We're also working with BBID and CCWD for additional water storage. There's also regional partnerships on the table that can be forged, such as the ASR well field and system interties. The district has riparian water rights that are highly valuable as well. So for groundwater wells, the groundwater under the district is thought to be of poor quality. There's much more to be done here. There are 2 aquifers in most of the Tracy subbasin, the upper aquifer where all of the irrigation pumping comes from, as well as a majority of our data and contamination. The lower aquifer is below the Corcoran clay. The Corcoran clay forms a protective barrier, keeping the highly saline and relatively contaminated upper aquifer separated from the lower aquifer. As this clay lens gets closer to the foothills of the Diablo mountain range in the Delta, we know less about its existence, depth, and thickness. We're drilling a monitoring well through DWR, the Department of Water Resources, at the water treatment plant. And this well will give us a really good idea of where this clay layer is and how thick it is. And it gives us the possibility of drilling deeper into the lower aquifer, and it could provide a source of water, even if treatment's needed. Next slide. So aquifer storage and recovery. Next slide. Aquifer storage and recovery is a concept that allows treated water to be stored in the aquifer. Water is cleaned to drinking water standards and pumped into the aquifer. This forms a bubble, and because of the different characteristics of the water that you've put into the groundwater, these differences of salinity or temperature creates a small area of mixing only on the exterior of the bubble, and it keeps all the fresh, clean water that you want stored clean. The mixing stays on the exterior of this bubble, leaving this high quality in the center. Next slide. An ASR well filled would increase water availability for emergencies as well as high demand and growth. This would allow more operational diversification and flexibility. More work needs to be done after the monitoring well is installed to find a most appropriate place to put an ASR well field. The information gained from the well drilling will help drive the project forward. Partnerships are a great way to improve the regional water supply as well as cover costs. The district can also look to our neighbors since many have been installing ASR wells also. So other options to improve our water supply. We're working with the regional board with an application to claim rights to our wastewater treatment plant effluent. Next slide. This is called a change order petition. Our wastewater treatment plant has been undergoing a major upgrade from an SBR, a sequential batch reactor plant, to a membrane filtration plant. The change order petition will allow the district to claim rights to approximately 1,200 acre feet of water a year. The wastewater will be cleaned to a very high standard with the MBR filtration system. The pore spaces are so small, bacteria and viruses are too big to pass through. This highly treated water also improves the water quality in Old River. The equivalent amount of water that leaves the wastewater treatment plant can be pumped from Wickland Cut or through BBID pump station of Clifton Forebay. These are indirect pumping of wastewater effluent. Okay, next slide. The district has also purchased water from alternative sources in the past. Next slide. The district could purchase water if BBID's rights are curtailed. There's two options. One is to pay annually through a purchase agreement and pay a little less for the water over time, or the district can purchase water during a dry year and pay a higher rate for that water. Staff plans to forge more relationships with water supplies and work to purchase more water through different agreements. Next slide. And one more. Regional partnerships have benefits to all parties. The agreements made include interties to other water systems, such as the city of Tracy. Infrastructure is required, but it's not complex. It would be necessary to install electrical pumps, controls, valves, and telemetry. Next slide. Another option that we've been working on is the Los Vaqueros expansion. It's a regional partnership that staff is actively working on. The project includes a regional intertie and a partnership with BBID. This will allow for an emergency water supply to be stored in the reservoir and available to use during the canal cleaning or an emergency. The Delta water supply is at risk of a significant seismic event or contamination, making the source of water unusable. Having other sources of water reduces the impact that an emergency brings on. Next slide. Wickland Cut. Wickland Cut may provide the district with 20 cubic feet per second of water during an emergency. This infrastructure improvements include a new pipeline to the district easement, new VFD pumps, electrical, and telemetry. Next slide. The building's very old. It needs to be evaluated, and seismic improvements, I'm sure, need to be made. There's also the need for a new trash rack. Next slide. Benefits include improved water availability to farmers in the community of Mountain House. There's a regional benefit potential as well for the growing city of Tracy and Tracy Hills. Next slide. So in this effort for this project, staff traveled to Washington, D.C. with BBID's lobbyist, Dennis Cardoza. Mr. Cardoza successfully introduced us to several agencies. These meetings have been very successful and we've received positive feedback. Grant funding is a great way to financially supplement a project, but these are very competitive, and it's important to budget for these projects with the assumption we may not be fully awarded funding. Next slide. This one's kind of exciting for me, kind of shows our progress that we've made. How you can see, here you can see what the future looks like with this information, and this information is from the 2020 Urban Water Management Plan that was adopted in 2022. Go to the next slide, please. This is the graph I intended to use. I apologize. So you can see the population growth is almost reaching the BBID water contract of the 9,813 feet. So the riparian water rights that we've been working on bring that level up just a little bit more. And then that red line you see at the very, very top is the potential gains of water that we could have with the change order petition. And that concludes my presentation.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks, Karen. It's, again, we always want to emphasize, we do have a long-term water supply. The city couldn't have been, or the district couldn't have been approved without a long-term water supply. But it's important to have an emergency supply, which we don't have at this point in time. And even though we've won in court on our water right, the state doesn't always listen to that. And so it's critical that we have redundancy and that we have other opportunities, not just for emergencies, but potentially in the summer. And there is a more than slim chance that in the next 20 to 30 years, there could be seismic activity in the Delta, which we're fully dependent on right now, and you have to have a backup water supply because major seismic activity in the Delta could mean a week without water or literally years without water. So we want to make sure that we've got, and it's the same challenge all the cities in our region have, but in the past, being a younger city, the county, unfortunately, back in they did not require the diversification that we hoped we could have had sooner. But the board members have been very good since 2015 in taking all the steps necessary so we can diversify our water supply. And so part of your water rates each year, there is money being set aside so that we do have protection during droughts and emergencies. And that's the money that we can access and hopefully combine with grant money in the future. There's a lot of money out there available for water. There's also another 482 cities and probably 300 water districts in the state that also is seeking some of that money. But we are the largest community dependent on the Delta. And so the state's aware of that. They've been trying to be flexible with us and understand our unique situation. But our job at the district and its staff's job is there's certain things where we have to have 100% certainty, and certainly the toilets have to flush and there has to be water to go on the toilets. So we really can't just hope that nothing will happen in the future. So we've worked very closely with the board over the last 5 years and beyond to make sure that down the road that this will all be seamless. But we figure it's important at least once a year to give you an update and let you know that there's lots that goes on behind the scenes beyond just the annual delivery of the water. We have to make sure that we are not a casualty of a natural disaster that's not been planned for, or a casualty of the state, which often has good intentions in what they do with water. But I can tell you historically, whenever the state's trying to make things more fair, somehow it's always more fair for the Bay Area than it is for the Valley. And I'm not just saying that. It's just a matter of course. So out here in the Valley, we have to be very vigilant in protecting our water rights. We always get the short end of the stick on this thing. So thanks for listening this evening. Were there any questions on Zoom? None? All right, well, why don't we go on? Thank you again, Karen. And we're very lucky to have her. She's got a lot of experience in this, and it's going to be a game changer for us now that we've got bandwidth. Kajip? Karen, do you want to explain? The question for the folks not in the room is, how do we get our water from BBID? It's pretty straightforward.
Yep. So you have Clifton Court forebay, and then there's a pump station on the edge of the forebay, and it literally pulls water in and brings it about 3 miles to the water treatment plant. Yep.
There's a major pipeline coming straight up Byron. And so that was all, yes, as part of the the district could not exist without a reliable water supply. So BBID was a critical partner in the original creation of Mountain House, and there had to be an agreement between the county /CSD and BBID to access that water. And then, of course, it was up to the developers to front all of the cost of delivering that water from BBID. And well, one more. It goes to our treatment plant. The water comes in raw.
Yeah, the water comes in raw. We treat it through our water treatment plant. It's a conventional plant. So it has carbon filters. There are some chemicals involved. And you always want to disinfect your water. So we use chloramines, which is a form of chlorine. And then Everybody uses the water. It's collected in the sewer system, and then that water is brought to the wastewater treatment plant, and it's run through an equally incredibly complex plant to filter out the 5% solids, 1% solids out of the water to put the clean water back in the river.
We're putting better water in the river than what's in the river as it flows by. I can assure you that. We purchase water from, we pay BBID because there's a lot of costs to deliver that water. And then what we're doing now through this change order petition is after we discharge that water, we're now working to get credit for that water so that we still will have to pay for the conveyance of it back to us in the future. But we're now within our water rights that would increase our total possible allocation from 9,800 acre feet to over 11,000 acre feet. So it's about a 12% increase in the potential available water we have. I think in Tracy, they have about 6 million, I think, acre feet that they're, or 6,000 acre feet, I'm sorry. All the math on these things is very complicated, but Tracy does that. It's very common for valley cities to get a wastewater credit. What they do in some communities is they actually take the water from the plant and run it through purple pipes for all their irrigation in parts of the community. But that's a huge investment. It's a lot cheaper just to put that water back in the river and then pipe it back to you than it would be to try to set up a separate non-potable system for all your irrigation. It works in certain circumstances, but for us, it's virtually no cost to discharge, get the credit, and then bring it back. Not no cost, but far cheaper than putting in a massive purple pipe system within the community. In some circumstances, other communities do that. But for us, because we're discharging right down upstream from where the water is getting picked up, it makes sense to discharge it back into the river. And like I said, there's just so many other options, but the bottom line is the water, all of our water right now comes from BBID. There's 100 offshoots of that Karen's working on, with Wickland Cut being one of the most critical, because in an emergency, if we can't get water out of the Delta and we can have the San Joaquin River, we could access out of Wickland Cut, and we would just have a pipeline going up Byron Road where we already have an easement, and that would give us a second source of water in our plant. It's critical that we not just have one pipe. In the long run, you don't want just one pipe coming into town. You want to have backup supply. That's why we're also meeting with the city of Tracy. They've got water supply right up to I-205 that in an emergency could be pumped into our tanks in College Park as well. And we're having dialogue with them, but there's a lot of complications. They have their own water pressure, their own water quality. There's lots of things the techs have to work out on that in order to do that, but it's something that would be a benefit to them as well. So they already have a lot more diversity than we do. But they've been at this for 30 years, trying to find all the different supplies of water. Yes, ma'am. From Hetchy, that's on Los Vaqueros, I think, that would tie into that, I think. But yeah, there is indirect ways of getting the Hetchy water. But right now we're focused primarily on just the emergency supply, but that's something that we would work through indirectly through BBID has different things they're doing. The answer is yes, but there's about 5 different steps to that process. I mean, there's all this stuff that Karen understands better than I do that connects into, they tie into, what's the other one down there south that BBID is connected into? What's down by Los Banos? What's that reservoir?
San Luis.
San Luis. So there's indirect through San Luis. The big, most immediate ones are Los Vaqueros and Wickland Cut and just the intertie. It's a lot more complicated as we get into other relationships with Tracy. But the irony is, of course, is the incredible amount of water that flows right past us on a daily basis for Southern California. You know, the state and federal water projects come right by us, and we don't really have access to those. But we have there's other creative ideas we've looked at. For example, Mountain House Creek in Alameda County. There's the potential to make that a storage, potentially with the property owner, potentially digging out an area for storage there. We're looking at some outdoor storage right behind the water plant, for example. We're looking at every different opportunity that we can. And again, we're working a lot with these owners just outside town who have water supply, because as you go east, the groundwater and the aquifers are much better than they are as we get up here towards the foothills. But we'll learn a lot more from this pump this well that we're doing at the plant right now. And she mentioned at the beginning that all the cities that are in the same groundwater basin, it's not like the old days where it's every person for themselves. Now we meet on a regular basis to figure these things out and make sure that everyone is equally sharing in the aquifer and making sure it's recharged and we're not further draining our. We've come a long way, but it's very complicated, the whole process. Very. So the
I think that
question was, why is the well water nearly drinkable water?
I think I was talking about the wastewater. Yeah, the wastewater effluent, you have certain levels of, like, the California Title 22 is a code law for drinking water standards, and to drink that water, the water has to meet those standards. But wastewater effluent doesn't have those same standards. So there is work right now in California for direct potable reuse, where they're taking wastewater and piping it after it's been cleaned directly into drinking water systems. That's coming. That's right. In the future. Mm-hmm. No, it goes out to Old River. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the quality for ag water is very different than your drinking water. And all throughout the county, even back before you didn't have as many nines behind how clean it was. And that's been a big debate at the Board of Supervisors for decades over what is the level of quality you can put in your farmland. And down in Southern California, that's a huge, in fact, toilet to tap, as we're not supposed to call it, is very, I think that's a good chunk of the Orange County water system now. But the county here, because they're very sensitive, being a top ag area, and particularly the wineries and others have been very sensitive to what the county will allow as far as discharge that can be used on our crops. But the plants are so much cleaner than when they started these debates 20 years ago. I think it's far beyond what drinking water probably was 50 years ago. When she did her wastewater presentation, we'll do another one of those soon, she gets into just how incredibly pure that, how many nines is it? 99 point?
It's a 16 log removal is the drinking standard that wastewater has to be in order to drink it. And then our plant, I think, is a 7 or 9 log
So
removal.
99 plus 16 nines is drinkable. We're 99 plus 9 nines right now.
Yeah, it's, yeah, a lot of nines.
Right.
It'll never be 100%.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think Carrie had the next question. So the question was about wells, and Karen's been talking to the main property owner about, we have the one well, and then you've been talking about other potential well sites, correct? Yes.
So the further you get closer to Tracy, the more we know about the lower portion of the aquifer, because it's separated. You have a clay lens, it's non-permeable, water can't go through there unless you drill a well through it. So that clay lens acts as a protective barrier to the lower aquifer. We just don't know how far that stretches out towards us. So when we drill the monitoring well in at the water treatment plant, we'll be able to see, it should be about 800 feet. So you should be able to find that clay lens there. So as you go closer to the east, the water quality improves in the lower aquifer, and that's where most urban folks are pulling their water from. The wells that are around us right now are ag wells. So the water that they're pulling is highly saline. They almost can't put it on crops because it will kill your crops. And it's really contaminated with all sorts of pesticides and other chemicals.
Mm-hmm. About the second, well, until 2015, the district had always been assured that the BBID source will never be curtailed. So since that time, all this work has begun to look at all these different resources. And as we were looking through the resources, the change order petition was one that we've now included in that as we've looked at all the different possibilities. But when the Board of Supervisors approved the plans for Mountain House back in the day, they were assured that that Mountain House was at no risk for their water supply. And in addition, there was a requirement that before the first building permit, the county was supposed to ask the district to begin looking at secondary supplies, but there was no board of directors then, and the Board of Supervisors made the decision at the time that they weren't going to require the developer to do that. So there were decisions made 25 years ago, before anybody in this room lived here, where they decided it was such low risk. And I think, frankly, the private parties at the time didn't want to spend the money. But I think once we got into these drought years, that's when all the planning has begun. And this change order petition, we're almost done with it at this point in time. Now, he had the question next, then you, Dan. A what? Go ahead, the monitoring well?
So with the groundwater sustainability agencies that we belong to the BBID Groundwater Sustainability Agency. The Department of Water Resources wants to do more monitoring of the groundwater levels and of some other different chemicals that they want to look at. So DWR is drilling a monitoring well at our water treatment plant, basically through BBID GSA. No, they won't put a pump in it, unfortunately.
Right.
And you won't be able to in the future either. It's not designed the same.
Probably not gonna be, yeah,
No.
it's more.
It'll be little.
Well. Dan? Yeah, there were some funds I know set aside before I got here, and yeah, all the tests showed that the quality in Mountain House for groundwater is not good. Yeah. Well, the negotiation with Tracy that we've been involved, well, that's part of this groundwater plan where we're part of the same basin as Tracy. And so discussion one has been about well, I don't know how much we've had that's been, but one of the discussions was an ASR project with Tracy. Have we talked about that at those meetings lately?
I'm not sure if we got to that question, but we've definitely been talking about an intertie.
Right. The one of the hopes that we talked about then, but we haven't been able to get to with Tracy yet, there's so many other things going on, is potentially sharing an aquifer with, an ASR well with Tracy over towards the traffic circle. I think it would be where that's in their sphere. So it makes sense that it's an area where we could easily pipe the water back here. And it's one that works for Tracy in that location as well. But they've had a tremendous amount of staff turnover in Tracy, as you may know. And so it's been difficult to sustain those discussions. And we've been more focused on the more immediate issue of the short-term interconnect. And we've done more work on that because I think there's some benefits to the folks in that business park down there as well. So if we can find something where there's an immediate win-win, that's what we're hoping we can get. But there's still a lot of engineering left to figure out on that. The good news is we do have the Crimson pipeline going under the freeway right there. So that might be a good logical play. It's a lot easier to go under an existing easement than to have to put a pipeline under the freeway bridge or something like that. So it's really more a question of just getting it a priority for them, and getting their water treatment people comfortable with the concept to make sure it doesn't impact their pressure and things like that, right? Anything you can add to that?
Yeah, I mean, they're at a different elevation than we are. So all of that puts different, parameters on pump settings and stuff like that to get water transferred back over here or back over there, whichever way it would work.
But I think for both of us, it never hurts to have more redundancy. So we're continuing to have those relationships with Tracy, and I'm hoping as some things stabilize staffing level over there, we start having discussions with one person and then there's a new contact person over there. And I think in my 5 years, it's been 4 or 5 different people that we've been working with at Tracy. So it's been a challenge, but that's why we have to have our finger in many dikes here to see which one. We know they're not all going to happen. And the other thing that is picking up steam now and getting a little more serious is Los Vaqueros. But again, that's a 10-year project, most likely, but that could be a real major asset. And we've already been doing some other behind the scenes work on that to test different ways we can access Los Vaqueros in the future and access water that direction if need be. But every one of these is got about 10 subplots to it that we have to work through. But we just wanted to assure you that we've been working very closely with the board and all the other agencies to do everything we can, because the one thing we know for sure is it's going to get more complicated and more expensive, not easier. So the sooner we can do that. When we met with the gentleman who has changed that, what are they called? Not the Delta Keeper guy, but the guy who's in charge of the Delta.
Water Master.
The Delta Water Master. And what he told us 2 years ago was there's a lot more conservation that needs to happen in California. And we'll know that California cities are serious when these cities start looking more like Santa Fe instead of Beverly Hills. I mean, that was a direct quote. And we did explain to him that and they've been sympathetic to us, that we have we have an urban forest that's very critical to us. And so we have very efficient homes for water, but we also have trees and we want to continue to water those trees. And they've actually, as we've looked at potential emergency scenarios and things like that, they've given us a better baseline of water than they would a typical community, because they understand that not only is it an important urban forest, but it's one that if you stop watering, it could become a major fire hazard very quickly as well. So we continually have those dialogues with them to make sure we can protect our infrastructure in the long run. But it is one of those things that when there's not enough snow in the mountains, Karen and I don't sleep as well. We always stress out until the snowpack's full. It's always a time, as she said, it's only a question of when the next drought is and how soon. I mean, that's just the history of California. That's Bernice. History will repeat itself, and we need to make sure that we have to have a very diverse water supply. And so I'm glad you guys were here to hear about that. That's our big focus, is making sure that we have a diverse supply. Can't live off one. All right, so are we ready for incorporation? We've got some more things we can add this evening. And as I may have mentioned at the beginning, if you have questions, I think we have sheets in the back and the front and pens. If you have questions, just go ahead and write them down and give them to Jody as we go through the presentation, and then we can figure it's easier to go through the presentation and then answer all the questions at the end. We just printed out our first mailer that's going to be going out to all of the households in the community. But if you wanted to get one now, we've got a bunch up here at the front. If you want to grab one, and this covers a lot of the information we're going to be doing this evening. So we're exactly 49 days away from March 5th. I don't think I have to tell anybody that. 49 more days until the ballot measure slide. And we'll try to give you a good overview. And what we attempt to do at this meeting and the meeting on February 6th is to answer in a little more detail the things that people have asked more questions about more recently. So we'll give the overview, and then we'll get in a little more detail on the areas where we've had the most interest. So I think I've seen a lot of previous presentations, but as we mentioned, we're now in year 30 since the county adopted the master plan. I think it was like the week after I moved to San Joaquin County in fall of 1994. That's a ULI article from back in the day with the good old artist concept of Mountain House in 1994. And just a reminder, in that original vision, it was always designed and assumed that Mountain House would eventually, depending on the voters, become its own independent city. Next slide. So wow, it's raining up there. So the actual groundbreaking was Memorial Day weekend 2001. These things, so between 1994 and 2001 was a lot of work to figure out, finalize the master plan, come up with the financing plan, all the agreements, finance, builders. So it took a 7-year period, and then, as you all know, they couldn't have hit the market better at the time. And 10,000 residents by 2010. Then everybody who was here back then remembers there was this little hiccup that our friends down at Lehman Brothers and others caused. It's a big hiccup, a very big hiccup. But since that time, as you know, by 2013, Hanson and Cordes really took off like lightning. And in fact, Hanson, I think there were 4 building permits left in Hanson over there at the Langston project. They just pulled the permits on those last month. And in Cordes, they just pulled the final building permits for Langston over in that neighborhood. So other than the lots where the models were located, I think everything is built out in Cordes at this point as well, other than that one house that's hiding back there off of Grant Line Road. So they're pretty much built out at this point in time. And as you know, that we completed this building, it's easy to remember the first day of the COVID shutdown, because it was the day we thought we were going to have the opening of this building, March 17, 2020. It's almost 4 years now. And we've been very busy the last couple of years. There's been some development down south, but the big thing the last 3 years has been getting ready to jump Byron Road. And so we expect later this year that north of Byron is going to be opening, and it will no longer be the bridge to nowhere. It'll be the bridge to the new fire station that's going to be breaking ground. Pardon? Bridge to somewhere. And the new fire station, which is, thanks to inflation, is going to be about 3 times the cost of the original fire station, but smaller, is part of the requirements from the county for building houses up north, along with the fact that your elevation is much lower there, so you actually have to pump up to the sewer plant. Not the rest of town flows down to the sewer plant, but north of Byron has to flow up to the sewer plant. And so you need a little help to have sewage flow up versus down. And so we can't have any houses done, of course, until the toilets can flush. So that's just about the pump station, or is it what we call a lift station? Lift station is going to be completed later this year. So those are the little things you don't hear about, but I know grocery stores are important, but lift stations are really, really important if they didn't work. You can't drive to Tracy if you don't have a lift station. You have to have it here. The next phase of Central Park, we're hoping will be designed this year. The board approved the design about 1.5 years ago for phase 2, and we're hoping that we'll be able to break ground on that this fall for the next phase of Central Park. That includes the amphitheater, tennis courts, and dog park. And we're working on the timing for the phase after that, which would be the sports fields and the ballpark. And the lot of work, as we mentioned, has been going on with the water. We expanded significantly the water treatment plant about 5 years ago, and the tanks in College Park, which is part of what got Hanson, Cordes, and College Park going, where those big tanks you see next to the college were all done the last 5 years. And then the other most important thing for North Byron is the expansion of our wastewater treatment plant, which Karen mentioned a little earlier as well. And we're literally, and she's heard me say this 1,000 times, we're operating a water treatment plant as you're changing the entire processing methods, just like flying an airplane and changing the engines. So we're real close to changing the engines now, right? Painfully close, right?
We're getting there.
Getting there. Getting there. So that's that big giant building you see rising out of the sky north of Bethany. So lots happened again then in the last 28 years. And particularly in the last 5 years, we've been doing a lot of work for moving towards incorporation. Actually, the last 8 years. Was anybody here on the committee back then? Brian was, Mar was. So we had a citizens committee that brought it forward to the board. Beginning about 2019, 2020, we got into the nitty gritty of all the financial analysis. And back this fall, the LAFCO approved on a unanimous vote that we were financially feasible to go forward, and the county put it on the ballot for March 5th. Next slide. And so the best way to describe it is because when you get the ballot, there's nothing that's going to say incorporation. It's this big long thing about reorganization. So the important thing for the incorporation measure is you look for measure D on your ballot. I haven't seen a printed out ballot yet to see what else is on there, but I think these may be the only measures on the ballot. They just go alphabetically from election to election. So I think they had B and C last election, so it's D this time. So there isn't any A, B, C, I don't think. Pardon? And E, we'll talk about that in a second. And that's essentially the result of all the meetings we've had since 2016 leading up to tonight and on to our next meeting. It's a big, long section that talks about reorganization. And basically by reorganization, it means that we're now independent instead of connected to the county. So next slide. So why did we do this? Why did the board decide to do this? It allows us to do everything we do now and be an independent community. It allows us to get more dollars than we would get otherwise. Right now, all the sales tax that you pay in Mountain House goes to the county. Anything else you purchase, and we'll talk about that in a second, any other town that's connected to Mountain House goes to the county. Each city in the county gets a per capita share, meaning based on your population, every city gets a share of the gas tax you pay when you purchase gas in the county. And right now, all that money goes to the county, not to Mountain House. In fact, the county had designed it in the past where the county takes that money and they spend it everywhere but Mountain House. That's why when they redid Byron Road, you know where our boundaries are, because that's where the county maintenance ended. So when the county created us, they gave us a little extra property tax, but they didn't give us any of the road tax, and they left us with all the existing roads such as Wickland and Bethany and Byron and said, have at it. But remember, until 2008, the governing board was actually the Board of Supervisors. So when the Board of Supervisors were seated as the Mountain House board once a month, and they're doing a vote, you think they're going to vote for Mountain House or they're going to vote for the county. So essentially, it's like normally under the law, the incorporation study is paid for by the county, but when the county wrote the agreement with itself for Mountain House, they changed the agreement to say that Mountain House was going to pay for the study instead. So these are the things that once you're a city, you're not dependent upon the county anymore, and you get to have those revenues. And as you know, state law only allows cities and counties to be land use agencies. That is, the folks who designate the zoning, do all the planning for areas, the ones who determine zones and rezones. Only cities and counties have that authority. So if you want to have local control over your land use, you have to be a city. Otherwise, the county board of supervisors is in charge of land use. And so I think the land use is probably the strongest one, but what it does is it does bring all those meetings to Mountain House instead of you having to go to the county for those things. In addition, while we are lucky enough to be on the Valley Link board, and it's no coincidence that we're getting a station here and we do have representation, that's not true when it comes with other county boards, particularly what's called the Council of Governments. And they're the ones who collect there's some, as I mentioned, road money that's per capita. If you're you get so many dollars per person of road money, but there's a lot of other road money from the state and federal government that's discretionary. And that money that flows to the council of governments is then it's arm wrestled between the 7 cities in the county as to how that money is spent. But if you don't have a seat at the table, you don't really have a very good chance of getting any of that money. And it also dictates how much money goes to RTD. So you can imagine the bus district is going to be spending most of its efforts in the cities that have a vote on who determines their money. They've done some things here in the past, but I can assure you, particularly nowadays where they're getting less fare box revenue after COVID, they focus their energies on the folks who decide how much money they get from the council of government. So it's probably one of the most, other than land use, I think the most critical element of being a city is you have a seat when it comes to transit dollars and that policy. I mean, and again, even though we have a seat on the ValorLink board, the ValorLink board is partially dependent down the road of getting money from the council of government. So it's critical to help ValorLink to make sure that some of the 205 money that the council of governments is spending, we make sure, and our vote is there to make sure those dollars are focused on this part of the county and that money not going somewhere else. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit more. I think the next slide we talk about this a little bit more because there's a lot of confusion, and I think we've said this 100 times, but I think 105 times a day somebody on Facebook says, well, it's a tax increase, right? No matter how many times we say there is no tax increase. So let's go over to the next slide. So what happens is with sales tax, which we don't get any of now, and property tax, we're actually getting more of the tax, but the tax isn't going up. So what's happening is there's an existing amount of money, and we'll talk about it more in a second, and we get a greater share of the existing taxes that are generated within Mountain House. So next slide. So in Mountain House, if you go to Safeway or the gas station, your sales tax number is 7.75%. If we become a city, your sales tax rate is still 7.75%. Now, if the future city council wants something, let's say they want to add 50 police officers or something like that, and there's not the money to do that, what they've done in other cities is they put a vote to the community where they increase the sales tax. Tracy, for example, did a general sales tax that was kind of focused towards the parks that, by the way, they still haven't built, but that's another story. But otherwise, unless the community votes to increase the tax, the sales tax rate in Mountain House is 7.75%. And the difference when we're a city is of that 7.75%, I can't remember if I put that on the next slide or not, but essentially 1% of that 7.75% goes to the county right now because we're not a city. Once we're a city, that 1% of the 7.75% comes to Mountain House. Next slide. All right, good. So this shows you there's a whole bunch of state agencies that get the first 6%. So 6% of your sales tax goes to the county. It's confusing. If you lived in Colorado, for example, there, all of it goes to the local government. Every state is different in how they allocate their sales tax. But in California, 6 cents of the 7.75 goes to different agencies of the state. And I didn't think you really cared about that other than it's 6%. Another 1% goes to either a city if it's a city or the county if it's an unincorporated area. Another 1/4% goes to the state that then gets reallocated back to counties for transport. It's one of the many pots of money we have for transportation. You also pay money on gas for transportation. And in most counties, including this one, there's also an additional 1/2 cent voter approved tax called Measure K that also goes towards transportation and pays for roads and interchanges and things of that nature. So 6% to the state, 1% to the local agency, and then the other 3/4 go to transportation countywide. Next slide. And again, as I mentioned, each city also has the ability to levy additional sales tax up to, I think, 1 additional percent. And Stockton managed to get an extra 0.25% for the library on top of that because it's a library district. And so you can see that in Tracy, Manteca, and Lodi, they have half-cent sales tax that they put for local. In Lodi, in Lathrop, they have a 1 cent sales tax as well. And then in Ripon and Escalon, they do not. Brentwood's 8.75, but I'm not sure how much of that is local. But you can see, but in Alameda County, so those of you who buy things in Alameda County has a 3% countywide tax for human services and safety and other things. So while our base county tax is 7.75, Alameda County is 10.25. So when you're buying something over there, I mean, if you're going to the grocery store over in Alameda County, you're paying 2.5% more on taxable items than you are in San Joaquin County. Next slide. And so there's another interesting caveat here that is important for you to know. And it's kind of sales tax trivia, but it's important. And don't ask me about warehouse sales, because that's at a big dispute at the state level, and we'd need an entire meeting just to explain to you where your sales tax goes for your Amazon purchases. So once we're a city, we can spend a whole night on that. All I can tell you is they recently changed the rules, and Tracy got a huge windfall. It used to be spread countywide and statewide. Now it goes to where the warehouse is. And you can imagine how upset the people are over in Alameda County who are ordering all this stuff, and Tracy's getting the $20 million, unbelievable amount of money in sales tax. But that is at a big fight at the state level. So warehouse sales, well, yes, ma'am, experience. I'm going to explain that a little bit more right now. So first, let's talk about our current tax and what happens when you purchase something in another community. So generally, if you go down to Winco or to Target, you're going to pay 8.25%. If you just go and pick up a couple bolts or something at Home Depot, you're paying 8.25%. And all that money, that extra money, that 1% plus their extra half cent, all of that goes to Tracy. If you purchase something at Home Depot that's delivered back to Mountain House, let's say you bought a dishwasher at Home Depot, and it's got your zip code on there as the address, all of the sales tax still goes to the city of Tracy. However, what's called the sales tax override, that extra 0.5% they voted in, that extra 0.5% doesn't get charged to you if the final delivery of the product is in Mountain House and not in Tracy. So if you buy an appliance at Home Depot in Tracy, or if you buy it over in Alameda where it's 10.25% and it's delivered to your home, you're only paying the Mountain House sales tax rate, not the sales tax rate there. They still get to keep the sales tax generated, but you're not paying that extra money. And there's one other exception other than deliveries, and that's car sales. So no matter where you buy your car, you're paying the Mountain House rate, not the Tracy rate. So if you're buying a Tesla over in Pleasanton, you're going to pay, if you lived in Alameda County, you'd be paying an extra $1,200 in sales tax. But since you live in Mountain House, you're paying the 7.75, not the 10.25 sales tax in Pleasanton. But again, none of that money comes back to Mountain House. However, if we were to pass a 0.5 sales tax and you bought that appliance over in Tracy, you would pay the extra 0.5, and that 0.5 would come back to Mountain House. When I was city manager in Davis, we had virtually no retail in town. We did have some car dealerships, and we did have one Target, but the Costco, Home Depot, everything else was in Woodland. And we actually we did a 1% what's called override on top of our base. And we generated more revenue from the sales of people from Davis buying in other towns than we generated from the sales of the businesses in Davis. Because so many of the major purchases in Davis were all happening out of town. So that's one of the advantages of having your own local add-on. Conversely, you know, when the next time you get the phone call about our debt service on the water bill, let them know that when they bought that car over in Pleasanton, they saved $1,200 in sales tax. Not to mention, you pay a lot less with MID than you do with PG&E, like 50 cents. I would say in the summer, those of you without any solar are probably saving as much as $400 a month being in MID versus PG&E. Just take a look at your bill and look at your electric bill and look to see what it would be if that kilowatt hour was 50 cents instead of 20 cents. And I think you'd be amazed at how much money we save by being in MID, which is why they always complain they're not making any money here. But Lamar, now wait, we said we wouldn't have, well, I let Bernice ask questions. There's a small group. Go ahead. No, no, only if we put on an add-on. But what will happen in a car purchase is you don't pay the rate of where you bought it, you pay the rate of where you live. That doesn't come to us now. After anything purchased in Mountain House will stay in Mountain House now and not go to the county. Now, the reality is grocery stores don't generate much sales tax. The gas station at Safeway probably generates more sales tax than the grocery store does. And when the other gas station opens, that'll be a big sales tax producer. The other thing that potentially could be a big sales predictor is if we have some kind of warehouse that's final assembly. For example, at one time, a company that does the modular buildings for construction sites was looking here, but I think they're having trouble getting financing. If they located in Mountain House, every time they sell one of those buildings for $100,000 or more, that sales tax would reside in Mountain House. And so those types of uses are great because they take up a lot of land, they generate a lot of sales tax, but it's maybe 10 trucks a day. Unlike an Amazon warehouse where I don't care how much money they generate, the wear and tear on our roads would not be worth it, most likely. So nice low impact, high value users. For example, if we were to get a data center or something like that, and we put in a special utility tax, because that's another thing the city can do. There's a lot of potential generation, abilities for generation of a utility tax and things like that. There's different things, but the main question people had was about sales tax and where that sales tax money goes. And yeah, anytime you buy in Alameda County and it's not being delivered, you're paying a minimum, depending on which town you're in, of 10.25%. You go up to Stockton, you're paying 9%. Lathrop, 8.75. Here it's 7.75. So like I said, right off the bat, every time you buy a car, you're likely saving $500 to $1,000 living in Mountain House at this point in time. So on to property tax. Right now, Mountain House, depending on what neighborhood we have, property tax is not a flat rate across any city, because what happens is that it's dependent on what other taxing agencies are in that area, and I'll show you a chart in a second. But essentially, in Mountain House overlaps 3 different kind of historic water districts. South of Grant Line Road was a little bit BBID and a little bit West Side. Between Grant Line and Byron was primarily BBID, and then north of Byron was virtually nothing up there because they already had their own water rights off the river. And so back in the olden days, pre-Prop 13, each taxing entity, their own board could set their own tax rate. And there was no cap on the total taxes. So you could, in theory, every taxing agency could send you a huge tax bill. And by the way, you got all individual tax bills as well before 1978. And so the school district would send you a bill, the county would send you a bill, whomever, and they all independently set their rate. And on top of that, in the old days, the county would reassess your house each year. And from 1970 to 1980, the average house in this county went from like 15,000 to 90,000 in value. So you can imagine what happened to tax rates during that time, particularly people on fixed incomes, that a house somebody bought for $7,000 is now assessed at $65,000, and the county just raised their tax rate. And that's why Prop 13 came along, was because the state froze for 2 years. There were plenty of ways to fix this that other states did, but California is that old thing that Winston Churchill says, that we always do the right thing after we exhausted every other possibility. That's kind of the way the legislature is. And so, of course, Prop 13 occurred that said, guess what? We're going to cap all property taxes at 1%. And so what they did is they took the 1976 rates for every taxing entity and said, okay, the total amount of taxes generated then was 2.5%. We are dropping everybody's tax rate by 60%, and then that's your share of the 1%. So if you were, as the county, were charging 80 cents on the dollar, now you get to charge 30 cents on the dollar because everybody had to cut the rate. And now we're going to send out one tax bill, and nobody can change their rate anymore, and the county is going to collect it and give you your share. And so there's 1,017 different tax districts in this county because there's so many overlying entities. So we have slightly different tax rates in each part of town because of, BBID had a different rate in the central part of town than they did in the south part of town because they had to share that with the west side, and they didn't exist up north of Byron. So we get a little bit more tax north of Byron and south of Grant Line than we do in the center part of town because of just what the historical tax rates are. Like BBID gets 10 cents on the dollar in the middle of town, 5 cents south, and literally like 1,000th of a dollar north of Byron. So our rates right now vary from 15.7 cents of every dollar you pay. We get 15.7 cents in the central part of town, and north of Byron, it's 17.3, and it's kind of in between south of Grant Line. After incorporation, part of the incorporation study went through this big, very complicated formula that determines that because we're taking over certain county services, now that we're paying for 100% of police instead of a portion of police, now that we're paying for animal control and those sorts of things, now that we're paying for any sunk costs that don't get covered in planning, the county has to transfer to us a share of their 21, 22%, whatever it is they get now. The county used to get 50 cents, and in the early 90s, the state was now responsible for schools because of Prop 13. And so they made this big shift in 91 where the state said, we're bigger than you, and we dictate to you, county, so guess what? We're going to take half your property tax, and you're going to deal with it. And so you'll see in a second, and that's one reason that when we wanted to incorporate was right around, or when we wanted to create the district was the same time the county had lost half their property tax revenue, which is why we have the special tax. In the old days, we would have had more money from the county in property tax, but because the county lost all this money to the state, the only way that we could become a district is if we created those supplemental taxes as well. But through incorporation, they have to give us 3.79487% additional of their money. So our rates are going to be between 19.5 and 21.5 now. So of your dollar, we're getting a couple million, a little under a couple million or more, and as values go up, that will go up. That's a property tax. So there is no increase in property tax. Next slide. You can't increase property tax. It's set by Prop 13. It can only go up 2% a year. Yes, Bernice. No, it's set for incorporation. It's set by state law. It's a specific formula. The greatest we could get is that additional is 3.79487. We get that additional amount in our taxes, and it's set through a very complicated formula set in the government code. Well, we get right now, roughly 16 of the 1%. Now we're going to get 19 of the 1%, and they're going to get 19 instead of 22. So theirs goes down, ours goes up. It's just a shifting of dollars. You're still paying 1% on your property tax. The difference is we get 4 cents more, they get 4 cents less of that of every dollar you pay. And next slide. And then each year, your taxes can go up to 2% a year until you sell the property. That's the only time they can revalue your property is at the time of sale. Otherwise, it can only go up 2% a year. And right. And so, yes, there's no tax increase other than what was already locked in. The special taxes, those already have a potential increase. None of this has anything to do with incorporation. Each year, the county adjusts your property value. Each year, the board of directors determines whether the special tax goes up or not. That doesn't change with incorporation. So just like with the sales tax, it's just a shifting of who gets the dollars. There is no change in the revenue that is generated in that case. And again, as a city, they now have to give us our per capita share of road money, which again is a separate collection. Next slide, I think, will show if we got it done in time. Next slide. So a little hard to read, but this shows you the breakdown of what each agency gets. And so you can see there's county general is at the top. And then if you look at the very bottom, ERAF is the money the state took away from the county. And you can see, and Road District 5 is the money they gave us many years ago, and in return gave us roads we couldn't afford to maintain. You can see the library gets 1.6%, the school district gets money, Delta College gets part, the county office of education gets a chunk of the money, the cemetery district gets a share, little tiny share of the money, county flood control, county mosquito abatement, Byron Bethany, ourselves, and the state. So I think that's what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 different entities, of which we are one. But it all has to add up to 1%. And so all that's happening is that the county general is going to go down and the Mountain House is going to go up. But it still all adds up to 1%. So next slide. So we'll get more money, the county will get less money, but it's no different to the taxpayers. It's just that your money will stay more local now than it did in the past. But the way that formula worked again was that was money we now have to spend that the county used to spend. So there's no gain to us on property tax. There is a gain on sales tax. There is a gain on road tax. And there is a gain on what's called the documentary transfer tax. Any realtor knows that. Anybody who sold a lot of property. So each time you sell a house, there's what they call these documentary stamps. And that won't increase. Only charter cities actually have the ability to increase that tax. In fact, normally it's $1.10 per $1,000. You know what it is in San Francisco? It's at least 10. And what they're doing in LA now on houses over 5 million, it's like 20 now or something like that. So in the Bay Area, most of the Bay Area cities, it's a pretty penny. But for us, it'll be probably about $500,000 a year in revenue. The only thing we don't get, and this will be a discussion for the new city council, is we don't receive any of the vehicle license tax, which is wrong, but we will be fighting for that in the future. And it's a long story how one of the reasons most cities cannot afford to incorporate now is most cities weren't already designed with these special taxes like we were. And in the old days, the vehicle license fee, new cities were given a bonus vehicle license fee. But when the state was doing all their budget shenanigans between 2005 and 11, that went away. And there were actually 4 cities in Riverside County that incorporated that were depending highly on that money. It took them 5 years to get special legislation to get that money. But we've been working with a coalition of other cities that want to incorporate, but it's probably about 2 to 3 million a year and it'll be something that we'll sit down with the new city council and talk about, sharpening our blades and our elbows and going up to Sacramento and dealing with that inequity, that the one thing we're not going to get any of, and it's just for a bunch of silly reasons, is the vehicle license fee. That should be money that should be getting shifted to us, and it's not. In fact, what used to be is you used to get triple your normal amount your first 5 years. So next, so more incorporation city trivia for you there. So, and as we talked about the governance structure, essentially, right now you have a board of directors with a professional staff. This just shifts you to a mayor and city council with a professional staff. And as we've mentioned, that for CC&R enforcement, master restriction enforcement, we will still continue to have the district, and they'd be a subsidiary agency of the city council. Like once a year when they adopt the budget, the city council would have to adjourn from their meeting for 30 seconds, adopt the budget for the district, and then re-adjourn. But cities are not given the power of master restrictions enforcement. We were one of 16 special districts that were given CC&R enforcement. So next slide. So you can see that besides our 18 powers, we get 6 more. So we'll be the city of 24 powers now. And that includes land use, building and safety, code enforcement, animal control, economic development, and the one that's near and dear to many people in the community, and that's traffic control. Right now, in counties of less than 1 million, only CHP has power over traffic control. So we have to kind of nibble around the edges of traffic control, and we can only ticket traffic when it's in their general duties of other things they're doing. So we can become a lot more assertive once we're a city. And it also, from a code enforcement standpoint, we're very restricted in how we manage issues on the street, and we have much more ability to deal with abandoned vehicles and things of that nature. So when it comes to public rights of way, we now get full control, whereas before we were dependent on the county and CHP for that. So those are little subtle things that will make a big difference. Animal control, short term, we're assuming we'll just continue to contract that out, and that'll be a decision of the future city council, how we manage animal control in the future. Next slide. I built an animal shelter before. There's a lot more to it than you realize. Finance and budgeting. Right now, we've got property tax, the special taxes, and then our franchise agreements. As I mentioned, we get a lot more diversity of revenue that I've already gone over tonight when we become a city. Next slide. Measure E. There's been some discussion, but why don't we go ahead and go to the next slide where we'll have more discussion about Measure E. So just a reminder, March 5th is a at-large election, meaning all the seats are selected by the entire community, and that's an elected mayor who serves for 4 years, and then 4 council people. In that first term, the 2 highest vote getters will serve for 4 years. The next 2 highest vote getters will serve for 2 years the first time, and then those future terms will be 4 years. And that allows a staggering of the election, because you don't want to have a situation where all 5 seats are up at once. That creates transition issues. So the first time it'll be all 5 seats, and then after that it'll be 2 seats one election, 3 seats the next election, on and on. But 4-year terms, and the elections will be in November, not in March. So the first term will be a little bit longer to even things out. So the elections will be in November. Next slide. Okay, I'll look at that one. So 3 terms will be in 28 and 2 in 26. Next slide. And so for this first election, as I said, it's at large. You can everybody in the community votes for people, and you can have 5 people living next door to each other and they can all be elected. And I can tell you cities where that used to happen. So For future elections, the code require us to have the citizens determine one of three methods for electing council members in the future. The mayor's seat will always be at large citywide, but the four council members, there's three options. The first is to continue as the majority of the cities do in the state, and that's to have, particularly smaller cities, most of them still do at large, where anyone in the city can vote for anyone running for election. But you also have the option of two different ways of doing district elections. The first is the one most people are more familiar with, and that is, and we'll talk a little bit more in a second about how the districts are drawn, and that is that you have four districts, four council members. To run for your district, you have to live in the district, and only those in your district elect you. So that's your traditional by-district election. There's also what's called from district, and that's where you have four districts and you have to live in that district to run for city council. But in order, the theory is you want to make sure that each council district represents their constituents, but also thinks about the community as a whole. So while they have to live within a geographic area, the entire community votes for those people. Stockton did that for a number of years. There, they actually had a primary by district and then a final election from district, but they're a charter city, so they have more flexibility. As a general law city, these are the three choices, and you can always go back out to the voters in the future if you don't like that. And there's also options in the future, and I don't want to make your head explode, but there's the chance for things called ranked choice voting, but we'll save that for another day, because these are all the things you have to worry about now. But if you need 2 hours to make your head hurt, I'll explain ranked choice voting to you that they do in Oakland and San Francisco and other places. So at large, by district, from district. And so there's a lot of good resources. I pulled up, Rancho Cordova just went through district elections for the first time, and I found theirs was probably the best FAQ site. And they kind of give a good background of they have to be generally equally populated districts. So we're about 28,000 people. So you need about 7,000 people in each district. Members of the public can submit their own maps, usually bring on a consultant who's an expert in this. And so, but it's not as simple as just dividing the town by 4. You also have, the state law makes it very clear that you need to have robust citizen input. You want to try as much as you can not to divide neighborhoods, identifiable neighborhoods. It's not always possible, but the goal is you don't want to have it where you've got one neighborhood snaking into 3 different districts. The goal is to have as equal, most logically proportional districts as possible. In fact, I think at the last legislature for Board of Supervisors now, I think the state is now in charge of drawing the boundaries, but for cities, it's still the city council who would draw these boundaries. That's one of the reasons, you have to have this election first before those decisions are made. So you have to try and not divide neighborhoods. You try to have identifiable boundaries. And again, there's lots of language in the law, but if you have a part of town is going to double in population the next 5 years, because these districts are only drawn after each census, what cities will typically do is put maybe 10 or 15% less people in the district where they see all the growth. If there's one part of town that's going to get an inordinate amount of growth, like if they were looking here, they would look at south of Grant Line and north of Byron and say the districts bordering those 2 areas need to take into account that there may be 3,000-4,000 more people in each of those districts by the end of the census period. The next slide. And then there's a whole series of other things related to areas of it's a very complicated part of the law that continually gets more complicated. But the real clear thing is the districts have to take all these things into account. And then there's actual what are called communities of interest as well that they get into. If there is a certain identifiable group of people that all live in one area, you can't cut those folks up into 3 different districts. And typically, and I know the school district's going through this right now, you also, in a community with a lot of non-residents, you also look at how much of the adult population is eligible to vote as well. And you take that into consideration a little bit. But the key thing is communities of interest, equal proportion, and not splitting up and having illogical boundaries. So if you choose by or from district, before the next election, it would be the task of the city council to go through a public hearing process to draw those boundaries. And then 2 of the districts would be up for election in 2026. So whichever of the 3 options is chosen will then because in the future, now the county runs the elections, but in the future, the city in cooperation with the county runs the elections. But there's a lot more local control on elections once you become a city versus an unincorporated area. So just a reminder that there's the ability to go onto our website and read our FAQ, and we have added the more robust and detailed FAQ as well. Hopefully this helped a little bit as far as getting into more detail about the taxes and Measure E. Let me see what we've got here. We've got 2 questions. Good question. Somebody asked, do you know how many cities with less than 30,000 residents do some form of district? I know it's a very small amount. I had some information that's well out of date because there's been a lot of changes the last couple of years, but as of a couple of years ago, I think about 15% of the cities in the state had district elections out of our 482 cities, but I think that's increased. And mostly those were cities over, a lot of the focus has been cities over 70 to 80,000 and more, of which, believe it or not, I think there's well over, because I think Manteca is at 90,000. I think they're like the 100th biggest city now. So I think there's close to 150, 200 cities that most of the focus is on the larger cities. I think we're in the 200s somewhere if you ranked us as a city. So it's still majority at large. And like I said, some are looking at other ways of meeting the needs other than district, but that's a subject for another day. In regards to the car sales tax, there was a historically registering the vehicle under Mountain House rather than only Tracy. So they do it specifically by your address. Even if you're in a Tracy zip code, that doesn't matter. They look at exactly, they geolocate your address, and they look to see what, the State Board of Equalization has a matrix of exactly every address and what sales tax district that you're in, and it gets tied back to that. And as a city, the other thing cities do, because it's not always done perfectly, is there's a couple of companies that every city in the state hires, and they do audit. Everyone does a sales tax audit. Most folks who have hotels do a bed tax audit. I mean, one of the things, once we become a city, we'll be reminding everyone when you go into a store, sometimes chain stores will just bring a register from another one of their chains. So make sure when you look at your receipt that it's the address of the store that you were in Mountain House. We don't have a lot of that here, but I can tell you when I worked in Stockton, we found that about 20% of our cash registers were, coming out of Sacramento and other places. So there's a lot of monitoring that has to be done. But if the sales tax receipt has the right address on it, they make sure it gets here. And like I said, on the Home Depots and things like that, that's where you typically have one of these specialists in sales tax make sure that that money's coming to you, because that can turn, like I said, in Davis, that was over half of our sales tax revenue is money coming from other towns if you end up with the supplemental and thing. So what is the current estimate of homes that build out? We are now at 7,823 building permits pulled, because I checked and there weren't any pulled this week. And in fact, we've already had 41 permits pulled across the street here at the new project. They've already pulled out 41 of their 254 building permits. As I said, Cordis has pulled everything, Hanson has pulled everything, and everything in College Park built has been pulled, and we're about to have a lot more houses built. But 7,823 is our current number. The build out is 16,105. So we're just under half. And that includes, like I said, everything that's pulled. We have about 500 units under construction. A good chunk of those are the 304 apartments across the street.
May I ask a question?
Can you write it down, please? And we'll give it to you in the chat. Can you write it in the chat and then we'll answer? Yes, our zip code will remain the same. We don't have any control over the post office. As much as we'd like to have a post office. I understand we are getting a UPS store, so that's a good sign for people wanting to have a PO box in Mountain House. But it's very difficult. As much as we'd love to get our own post office and zip code, the post office's focus has been reducing their number of locations, not increasing their number of locations. But it's the federal government. In fact, when we were having some issues with the new mailboxes we were installing, I'd been working with a regional representative out of Sacramento. When the post office just did a restructuring of the reporting relationships, and so I assumed when the Sacramento person told me I'm not dealing with Mountain House anymore, I assumed I'd have to call the San Francisco office. But guess what? They gave the whole Central Valley to the Los Angeles office instead. So it just tells you the challenges we have with the nearest person now is 300 miles away when you want to go up the chain in the post office at this point in time. Okay, I'm sorry. Thank you. You caught me there. Will we have the town divided up in districts even if we have at large? No, we will only go through the expensive and process of drawing lines if the community votes here to have district elections. Otherwise, we'll just remain at large. That's a good question. He was asking about traffic violation revenue. We do get it as a city, we would get some of that revenue, but I can tell you that the vast majority of that revenue pays for that great big courthouse they built in downtown Stockton. Literally, that's where, that's how they were able to build all these new courthouses, is the vast majority of your ticket revenue goes to building and maintaining the courthouse. But we do get a little bit of that money. I'd have to look at the study, but it's not a whole lot. Even if we start ticketing a lot more, I'm not sure it's going to make a big difference in our revenue. I learned that the hard way when I was running a parking district, and I thought I was going to get all this additional revenue. All right, school taxes. And in California, schools are completely disconnected from local government. In fact, for example, in California, cities can only reside within an individual county. School districts can be, such as Lammersville, can be in multiple counties and overlap into multiple cities. We have 482 cities in California and close to 1,000 school districts. And the way it works with schools is each school district reports up to what's called the County Office of Education that then reports to the state. All the property tax you pay for schools actually goes up to the state, and then the state has a very complicated formula as to how that money is doled out, because about 50 years ago, back pre-Prop 13, there was such a huge inequity. I think, like, for example, I think in Marin County, they collected like 3 times as much as Fresno County did per child in education dollars. So there was a lawsuit, and so the state had to take control over school funding to make sure that you didn't have as bad a have and have not districts. And so the state funding for schools is, for the operation schools, incredibly complicated. And the funding for building schools is yet another subplot of that complication. So yes, part of your property tax does go to the school district, 19% where it says Lammersville, but there's another 26, 28% that goes to the state. And then I couldn't even begin to explain how that money gets back allocated to the schools. Part of it's based on how many students, part based on how many students show up on a daily basis. Part of it's dependent on how many at-risk students you have, all sorts of things. But when it comes to school construction, it's typically done through a combination of of bonds and Mello-Roos taxes, which are called community facility districts. And in Mountain House, the way the majority of the school, part of the school, the high school in particular, is funded partly out of fees the developer pays at building permit, and then the rest is paid through the CFD that's on each property. And then in your tax bill, if you see on there, there's two different bond measures. They're about 3 cents or 4 cents, something like that on your tax bill, that also go towards the construction of the high school and the addition to the high school. But the K through 8 schools are primarily paid through that, what's called that Lammersville Unified Community Facilities District. That's somewhere between probably $1,400 and $1,900 on your tax bill. And that's on for about 30 years. And I don't know if they've refied and extended any of those or not, but that's 100% through the school district. The good news in Mountain House compared to other communities is, I've complained a lot about the things that the county adopted back in the early days, but one of the good things the county did was the school district does not have to pay for the land that the schools are on. In other districts, for example, the last school, the construction cost for Costa was about $59 million. If they had had to pay for that land, it would have been another $20 million for the land. So in Mountain House, what happens is every developer has to allocate 21.2% of his property towards public uses. And then there's about 50 subplots to that. But essentially, all the roads, all the schools, all the parks, all the drainage basins, all of those things, we don't have to pay for. All of that is on the developer, and he has to dedicate all those facilities to us. In other communities, they have to go out and actually purchase those. So we actually get a pretty good bang for our buck when it comes to the schools and the parks, because we don't have to buy them. You talk to people in other communities and they'll talk about the frustration they have trying to fight over a price for land. But that $1,400 to $1,900 on your bill is what pays the bonds to fund those elementary schools. And then that smaller amount on your tax bill pays for the high school, a good chunk of the high school. Was there another question or no? A couple more, okay. Okay. So if Measure D is not adopted, what's the impact of revenue neutrality? If Measure D is not passed, it's status quo. And I think, in fact, the way the law works, the county has to pay for the election if we lose, which is probably about $100,000 for the election. But if we win, we do have to pay, the district or the city does have to pay for the election. But if it fails, it's on the county. And everything we negotiated is moot, and we're back to being a dependent agency of the county like we are now when it comes to working on the areas the district is not responsible for. So essentially nothing changes if Measure D fails. So why is the school district in a hurry to do the by district? Why can't we do it collaboratively? Well, first of all, we have a whole different set of rules there's different rules for how school districts draw boundaries. Secondly, they will have 5 districts, we will have 4. Third, they have thousands of acres outside of Mountain House and residents outside of Mountain House as well. So our boundaries will have, while 80% of the population, 90% of the population is the same, it's 5 districts versus 4 districts and entirely different criteria. So there's really no connection with the way we would draw district boundaries and how the school district is drawing their boundaries. And again, they're an independent entity, so we don't have any ability to tell them to stop. But like I said, by them drawing the boundaries, we will be able to see some of the data that they've already used, which would come in handy if we end up drawing boundaries. But there's also a number of issues with their data that they need to fix. And part of the challenge is that us being a smaller community, we have the 2020 census, but the more detailed data that looks more at other characteristics, that doesn't get updated as frequently in a place like Mountain House as it does in larger cities a lot of the time. So a lot of the different criteria that the demographers like to look at, the 2020 is going to be the best data that we have. Although we haven't, we probably added 15% of our population during that time, but there's going to be other sources if we get to that point. But by the time we do it, they'll probably, hopefully, we can find the data that we need. But yeah, they have very different boundaries they have to draw. When you have large, even unoccupied areas that cross over different kinds of boundaries, it really changes the dynamic for how you draw your boundaries. So are there any more questions online? No? All right. Just remind me to repeat the question. I'm sorry. Residents of Builda. I'm sorry, I was wrong there. About 60,000. Right. We're looking at about 60,000 right now. And we've sized and we've used those estimates when Karen has to periodically update our demand for our water and sewer. And I think that was the number we used this last time in the master plan. We went into a lot of detailed analysis. Yes, sir. That's permits pulled is 7823. I think we're in 73 and change that are occupied, and that's not including the ADUs. There's about, I better not quote it. I think we're at about 608, a little over 600 ADUs now. There's no restriction on how many they can pull a year, but the most we've ever had were in the early days. There was over 700, probably in 04, but our peak years are usually between 500 and 600. It was about 170 permits this year because we were pretty much built out this past year. But I would expect that we'll have a bit of a spike because we've had about 2 years of getting North of Byron ready. Lennar has 503 lots they're moving the dirt on right now. There's another 453 lots in neighborhood J, not far behind, a little bit of K. And then let's see, Pulte's got 286 lots they just closed escrow on next to Costa School. And then there's another 266 just south of Costa School that hopefully will be closing soon. And then 143 at the dead end of Nazargoli. And by the way, those are the lots that are required to put in or do the study on the RRF, the rapid rectangular flashing beacons on Central Parkway is part of that project. So we're about halfway through. As far as retail, in fact, I'm going to bring something to the board of directors next month. The county is getting a little update on the jobs housing balance study of the late 90s. And we're going to be bringing that back to the board. But, we did a study at the August 2020 meeting that showed that the area that was zoned for retail and commercial was probably about 2 to 3 times what the community could support. Because when they did the original analysis, Walmart was the only thing north of 205. None of that development over in Tracy was contemplated when they did the original projections. And then on top of that, Target's now cover an area of 200,000 people, not 50,000 people. And the Walmarts, Targets, Costco's, Winco's now take about half of the sales of a traditional grocery store. So if you look at the volume of our Safeway so far, it's doing less than Discovery Bay, for example, because the big stores over in Tracy still take such a huge chunk of the sales. And even the New Indian Market does a decent amount of sales. And the Hispanic market over on Tracy Boulevard gets a lot of sales out of Mountain House as well. So your traditional grocery stores have really been chopped up by the big box stores and the specialty markets. So in a town like Mountain House, you're looking at one Safeway, probably max, which really reduces the demand for. When they designed all this, they were assuming one neighborhood center for every 10,000 people. Now you need one neighborhood center for every 50,000 people or so. So the face of the other thing that's happened is a lot of these projects like the Panattoni project, which is, 40% full now. Those were the types of projects they thought would be very attractive to this area back in the 90s. And what's happened is that, the big boxes have taken over. When they built that, they really thought that they would be capturing a lot of small manufacturers who are going to get evicted from, not evicted, but their lease is not renewed in the East Bay. But when COVID hit and suddenly Oracle didn't have an appetite for more office space, those businesses have either stayed in the East Bay or they've looked out at the valley and they've said, well, Mountain House is part of the Bay Area now. I can't afford that. So a lot of those folks are going out to Merced and Stanislaus County now. So a lot of the type of uses they thought they would intercept here. And when it comes to the big office space, as you all know, across from Kimball was supposed to be the equivalent of PeopleSoft Oracle over here, and you can see how well that went. And so there's virtually zero demand for office space out in this area. There's such a glut in the Bay already. So we're going to be giving an update. The county's going to begin an update, and I'll bring it back to the board on what the anticipated demand for retail, industrial, and commercial space is going to be in the future. Because with a lot of this land, we have the choice of it sitting empty, or there are some housing allocations not yet used, and you can either have $1 million a year generating for more houses or have nothing generating off of that site for 30 more years. So yeah, if we don't get, what we've done is we've kind of, the economics of commercial businesses have really changed over the last 20 years. And part of that is a function of how much public safety costs have increased over the last 20 years. And also this is a whole dynamic of how much sales tax is generated. The amount of sales tax generated by your larger stores has not gone up at the same pace of what it costs for all the additional services you have to provide to have those businesses. In a lot of ways, for the future, we have the perfect design where a lot of the stores that create a lot of the policing challenges and traffic and road challenges are next door in Tracy. And so it greatly reduces our need for, police officers, which are fully loaded at least $250,000 per year for salary, benefits, their cycle, their bike. So a big box, some of these, a Target might generate, if you could get one, $500,000 a year in sales tax. The reason a lot of these cities do these supplemental sales tax is because the 1% isn't enough. People like Lathrop added another 1% because that's the only way they could pay for the additional police and fire that they need for all of the businesses. Because in a lot of cities, public safety, most cities pay about 3 times what we do for public safety, 3 to 4 times. And if you don't have a lot of business, it actually typically reduces your demand for public safety. What we are finding, and so when you look at the economics of whether a lot of these businesses pay for themselves, because of our structure, the residents here pay for themselves, but I'm not sure a lot of the businesses will. Safeway probably doesn't pay for itself, but we do need certain level of amenity in the town. Mountain House developers spent $9 million in infrastructure to get a $2 million land sale for Safeway. And again, Safeway is not going to be at full capacity in that store for another 10 or 15 years. But, we're lucky to have them. But again, the economics of retail has changed a lot where it's very expensive to service retail because of the huge increases in our costs that we really can't do a lot about. So I think that we've got the reason our economic fiscal model came in so well at our current level is because we don't have a lot of the high costs associated with having really intense amount of retail, frankly, and some of the other businesses like retail. And in a typical older bedroom community where they don't have the special tax, and back when houses were only $100,000 in this county, houses did not pay for themselves. But now that you're generating a lot more money per house, houses are more profitable than than businesses a lot of the time. And the other thing the city study will show is that we've done these surveys periodically, and we actually have, working in our homes now, even post-COVID, we have the equivalent of 2 or 3 high-rise, mid-rise office buildings. We have the equivalent almost of an Oracle business park here in Mountain House because of the number of people who are working at home 3 to 5 days a week. So our office park is upstairs in everybody's house. Yes, yes, they are in this community. And it's just more true nowadays because houses do not generate the police calls of your typical business. And in the old days, the argument was, well, houses don't use your parks and things like that. But the big cost isn't your parks facilities, it's your public safety facilities. If you get enough large buildings, you need additional fire trucks, and we all know what those cost. So we're really designed to be more economically feasible in the future. And so in the future, and if we have land use authority in the future, we can have more dialogue about what the appropriate zoning will be for uses in the future. That's dictated by the city. The first 3 years that the city would be incorporated, you will go through what's called a general plan process, which will be updating the master plan and be looking out 30 years as to both the existing community and the potential for additional. You'll look out, and it will be a very robust discussion, and it's going to be very expensive, but it's something we can charge to future development. It's probably about a $5 million process to go through the requirements to adopt a general plan. And I don't want to go through, I think I need to be here till midnight to explain to you all the elements of the general plan, but it's a very exhaustive public participation process where you set the blueprint for land uses in the community for the next 30 years. And the state gives you about 3 years to put that plan together. We're part of the county general plan now through our master plan, but once you're a city, you're required to update that. Yeah, as far as AMR, we'll talk about that at the next public safety meeting, but one of the things being a city will give us is a better seat at the table when it comes to emergency management services, because that public safety, as Director Dillon knows, we've been getting the short end of the stick on ambulance service. And there's other discussions we can have. One of the challenges, a lot of folks say, well, we want paramedics on the engines. One is very expensive, but it's not just money. It's the challenge of even hiring firemen with those additional criteria nowadays. They're having a real hard. If you have someone with that, they're typically going to go to the highest priced agency because they work. Firemen, because they have 48-hour shifts, can live anywhere. And so they can live anywhere, and they can also choose the most expensive cost areas to work where they're going to get paid the most. So out here in the valley, we have an impossible time hiring folks into the fire service with those additional requirements. And so that will be another dialogue with the city council. But the first step will be they're just now beginning to put together for a year from now the RFP for the next round of ambulance service countywide. And as a city, we have a seat at the table that we don't have now. The challenges, I will caution you, is that the ambulance companies have been very active in Sacramento, and they've done everything they can to tie the hands of the counties to the ambulance. It's kind of the tail wagging the dog, where the ambulance services are really set up to make sure the ambulance companies make money, not to make sure there's full coverage. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. That has to be the private sector to put together a facility. I can tell you, yes, it's a matter, we can do economic development as a city, and if the city council wants us to do that, we'll put an action plan together. talk about the cost, the possibilities. Those are things as a city we can be much more aggressive about than we can as a district. That's not specifically one of our powers, but as a city, we do have we can openly do economic development. One of the things just on the side is our fire department has been improving their relationship with AMR so that they will, when they're not on a call, we try to get them to have some of their wait time here in Mountain House, which they didn't do in the past. So we're working all we can to make sure they're over in this area. But that's another area where we'll have a lot more dialogue, and it isn't, so yes, both the seat at the table and the ability to do economic development. So did I skip anybody's question? Did I miss yours, Dan? All right, I'm so sorry. Mhm. Right. Right. So the question was about our special taxes and whether we need the special taxes or not, or as we add people, will they go away? The entire economic model for Mountain House was predicated on the special tax being a permanent element to the community, and with it going up at least 4% a year, which it is not we're at about 71% of where we should be, because during the recession and other years, there were a number of years where it was not raised 4%. And in fact, one of the challenges, if the community does want to have, for example, a recreation center across the street, we can't continue to not raise the special tax every year, because we're at about half build out, but we're only at about 20% of our amenities. And so actually the cost per person is going to be going up, not down, as we add more people, because as we get to a certain size, then we're adding 3 community park, we're adding a South Community Park, a North Community Park, and then a Central Community Park, which includes a rec center in 2 phases. So recreation in particular is expensive. And then we're going to be adding a second fire station. And that serves just not north of Byron, but south of Byron as well. And so all those additional amenities cost money. And because we haven't had a lot of amenities to this point in time, the board has smartly built up a reserve so that we also have money for asset replacement. But as we mature, and it's shown somewhat in the cash flows as we add these additional amenities, that special tax becomes more important than ever. And in the report, it makes it clear that that's a critical component. And if there was not a permanent special tax, this would not have been approved for a vote. And so the special tax is crucial. And as I mentioned, and in the future, for additional enhancements, that's where the council will have to wrestle on whether or not they look at other revenue sources. Okay, good. Anytime. That is our life. It is about 2/3 of our general fund revenue. And, people talk a lot about costs, and the challenge is that costs do go up every year. And, for example, we just had the waste collection go up. And a lot of our costs on the utility side are what are called unfunded mandates from the state. It's not our idea to have 3 trash cans and trash collection. That's imposed on us by the state. And then the state's nice enough to have us do the increase and not them. But we'll be talking a little more at the next meeting about some of these other costs for services. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what it costs in other communities compared to Mountain House, and show you what the different values can be. So thank you for all your time, and we'll stick around for any more, no more online, correct? And we'll stick around questions, and our next meeting is on February 6th at 7 p.m. We get a franchise. Yeah. We probably don't charge them enough.